Next presenter is Dr. Jesse Montes. Are you there, Jesse?
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hello?
Are you there? You're there.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'll just gonna pull up my presentation here. I am here.
Okay, so introduce yourself and then continue your presentation. Floor is yours.
All right, I'm calling from my home office in Canada at 6:30 in the morning right now. And I need to share my screen. Is that possible here? Oh, here we go. Sorry, I just have to allow Zoom to do that. Yeah, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jesse Montes. I am a previous senior lecturer at the Royal Thimphu College in Bhutan. I am currently working as a senior policy analyst for the Ministry of Forests in the province of British Columbia. So no longer living in Bhutan, but I did spend about 7 to 8 years living and working in Bhutan. So that's where I did all of my research and such. Now I do need to share my screen, but it looks like I'm sorry, co-chair, it's looking like I need to quit Zoom so that I can actually share my presentation.
Okay, can do that. Is it possible to do within 1 minute?
Yes, I'll get it going here right away.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, I'm back. And let's see if I can share my presentation. Okay, you should see my presentation now. Are we all good?
Yeah, it's visible. It's visible.
Great. Okay. So I already introduced myself, now in Canada. Now this research, you should have access to the to a document that I published in last year in 2020 from Conservation and Society. And this is a very similar title to that document. I know I'm talking on Indigenous knowledge and conservation. However, in this title, you don't see any of those words. However, it is very much related. And so I will be reflecting on the importance of Indigenous knowledge and its impacts on conservation. But you'll kind of see that reflected on in terms of some of the questions that I have, my initial research questions, as well as some of my final findings as well at the end of this lecture. So one thing I'm going to do right now is I'm not going to focus a lot on the theoretical aspects. I'm going to leave that to the paper and to the question period that I know you guys are having online. So if you do have more questions about things like landscape ethnoecology, something called the dwelling approach that Tim Ingold focuses a lot on in his research and his writings, I'm happy to engage with those on at a different time through that, especially after you guys have read the paper a bit more. You'll find a lot of clarifications in there. So landscape ethnoecology and cosmological toponomy of Ha Highlands. So landscape ethnoecology is essentially my theoretical approach. Cosmological toponomy. Toponymy is the aspect of naming aspects of the landscape, the naming of mountains, rivers, lakes, land features. How are those things named? And one of the things I noticed working in Western Bhutan in a place called Ha is that much of the naming of their features had a cosmological aspect to it. And so this is my experience, this presentation, as I interacted with these Highlanders who were primarily yak herders. So let's get into it here. So some of the research questions that I started with as I was interacting with these Highlanders is I wanted to know, how are they perceiving the landscape? And the reason I was really interested in perceptions, how they perceive it, is because, again, based on the theoretical approach I was taking, is that our perceptions of the landscape will also impact how we manage or how we interact in our surroundings. And so this follows the second question then, is how do these perceptions of the landscape, how do they actually impact our conservation practice? And then thirdly, how are these perceptions changing in light of livelihood changes? What we're seeing across the globe with all sort of nomadic populations is that things are changing. Things are becoming very less, I guess, there's not a lot of promotion of nomadic populations in today's governments across the globe. And so we're seeing the numbers dwindle. And the same is in Bhutan as well, that we're seeing that, and it's not necessarily from purposeful policy, although it might be in some cases. There are some countries where it's very difficult to manage and provide services like education and medical services to populations that are constantly moving. But what we're finding in Bhutan is that there's just a generational gap where the new generation isn't as interested in yak herding. And so what we're finding is that the younger generation are being drawn into the cities through the promises of education and better life services. And so what we're finding is that as that generational change is happening, more people in Ha, where I was working, are transitioning from things like yak herding to things like ecotourism, to other elements that are bringing additional sources of income into their communities. And so that's another question I was exploring. Again, I'm not going to talk a lot about this right now. Again, you'll see some of these references to Ingold's work and the dwelling approach in the paper, as well as to someone named Leslie Johnson on landscape ethnoecology. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about that right now. I'm going to go ahead and skip that. So talking about the context and the methods that I use. So here's a map of Bhutan. I actually spent a lot of time working in these three key areas, three provinces. They're called Dzongkhags in Bhutan. One is Ha, the other Thimphu, and then Wangdi Phodrang. And all this research right now is based in the Dzongkhag of Ha, on the western side of Bhutan. There you can see where it borders China and very close to India as well. So I was working in a place called the Isa Gewag in the Shokuna area. And this is so the Ha Highlanders that I was working with identified themselves working in the Shokuna landscape. And so I conducted ethnographic fieldwork from 2013 to 2020. In Ha, I was working with a single family yak herding family, but they also, again, were transitioning into ecotourism. So I conducted a lot of in-depth interviews. These were semi-structured interviews, so kind of going in with a list of key questions that I wanted to ask, and then allowed them to sort of guide the conversation. So sometimes the conversations would go in a direction I wasn't planning, which was really interesting because then I was able to, a lot of data started to emerge that I was not expecting. A number of field observations. I conducted 3 summer migrations with Highlanders, so going with them and watching them as they were moving their yak herds from one area to another. 3 to 4 visits per year, staying with a homestay operation in the area. A homestay was their ecotourism operation. And then I also facilitated a coordinated field survey trip with a group of 10 students from the Royal Thimphu College. So a bit more on this. Again, I was really interested in toponymy, looking at the words that they were using to describe their landscape as a way of understanding what their perceptions were, looking at what naming applications they were using for various features. So I would go in and spend time with a yak herder in their tent. Here you can see me with one of my students in one of our interviews. And we would conduct free listing exercises where they would just essentially, go out and start pointing at various features, whether they're mountaintops or grasslands or shrubs, and they would just start listing the various features of their environment. I'd bring photographs and we could talk about different elements. In field discussion where we would actually do transect walks, walking around the various landscape and having them describe what the features were, what were they used for, what kind of values did they see from them, and again, talking about the naming structure of those elements. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is I went in with a very quantitative approach, meaning I was using Excel spreadsheets, lists of features, lists of names, the translation into the local language, the use values. I was very much in a very sort of quantitative looking at what are these features, how are they being used, and what can be sort of said about how conservation practice is being played out in this Shokuna Ha landscape. And I really recognize a couple years into it that I had very much a research bias in terms of how I was directing things and how the kind of information that I wanted to find, and I was just looking for that type of information. Now I'm going to return to this because this was a big problem in my research, and I'll kind of get back to that in a minute. But first, I just share a few of these classification sets. One was topographic. It was very descriptive in nature. The features that they had, like here we have the translation here, whether it's the Ja, the Yiri, Yabuna. These are various namings and names that were very just descriptive in nature. They didn't have a special spiritual name or naming after an important figure or family member. So very descriptive in nature, and looking at some of these things like mountaintops, a wall of rocks, piled up rocks, and all these things were very important to them in terms of how they were mapping out the landscape, using it for wayfinding, how they could find various resources, whether it was certain edible plants or where they might be able to hunt for certain species. Another one is the forest ecology set, looking at different transitions from highlands into forests and what types of forests. Those were also very important to them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to skip this one. The grassland set was very expansive, especially because it had a lot to do with their livelihood, the different types of grasses, the different types of winter, spring, summer, fall grasslands that were used for their herds. So very in-depth. This is a very large set of classifications that I developed. And then there was a hydrographic set with water bodies. And this is where I started to recognize my research bias. The hydrographic set was we found that the namings were very much cosmological in nature, that they weren't just very descriptive like the deep lake or the blue lake, but rather they had spiritual names applied to them. The Na, Nate, Dung, Rim, as you can see on the left. And these are actually religious items used for Buddhist practice. And what we found is that all these lakes had very spiritual names to them. And we realized, well, why is that? So rather than focusing on my quantitative Excel spreadsheets, I realized I needed to shift the types of questions I was asking. And what we found is that there was a whole story of this landscape that we missed by just trying to focus on the names and focus on the classifications, and that these herders had a whole story about the landscape that was guiding their practices, that was sort of dominating why they did certain things on the landscape. And so I think in the next slide here, I have, well, here's just some more pictures of the lakes in the area. But what we found is that the different features were not just important for things like, you know, where to bring their herds or where to find certain elements, but it also, there were various spiritual sites on the landscape that were spiritual beings were believed to be held, that they needed to ask permission before they went to certain areas, that if there was bad weather, it might have been because of certain practices that they had, or they didn't, you know, maybe they left some trash and now they were sort of being punished. And so there are all sorts of things that were going on in the landscape that I was not seeing through my very sort of Western classification sort of mindset. And so there's other elements here I can talk about, orienteering and stuff, but I am going to have to skip over that as well. But I really want to focus on this story of what's called Rigo Tso and someone called the Tertan Shirab Membar. And so it's really important for this whole landscape, this story, and it's a very long story, and I'm not going to read it all here just because of time's sake, but the whole story is in my paper. But essentially what happened many years ago is that there was a spirit living in this lake, and I'll show you which lake it was. It was this upper left lake here, a spirit living in this lake. And this this very important figure in Bhutan came there to extract some treasures from the lake. However, this spirit living in the lake became very upset and started to chase this figure who had stolen all these treasures and was chasing this person throughout the landscape. And as the person's running away from this spirit, they're dropping various important elements, and as they drop, they become lakes in the shape of these important spiritual symbols. So they become the spiritual drum, the horn, these various elements that are important in various Buddhist rituals. And so the whole landscape is dotted with lakes, and they're all derived from this this story that is historical in nature to these Highlanders. And so what we found is that this story drives a lot of their practice. When they're doing things on the landscape, they have to ask permission. They have to make sure that they appease these local deities. And what it was doing is it was actually creating a whole system of very conservation-like practices. So the way that they were acting, they weren't because the law said they can't litter, or because there's a law that says they can't burn garbage. None of that. And nothing to do with sort of our traditional sort of modern society sort of ways of, you know, promoting conservation practice. But it was very much tied to this specific story and the belief in these spiritual beings that were governing the landscape. So some of the key findings from this, one, and I'll go in each of these in particular, but one has to do with resource management. Another about identity, how these Highlanders associate and sort of identify themselves as Highlanders. And the third is what I call socio-ecological relations, how they interact with their landscape. So the first one, resource management. Well, one we found is that the perception of the landscape motivates conservation-minded behaviors. The way they perceive it as a very spiritual landscape. And because of that, they also have this idea of reciprocity, that if they act in a responsible, in a courteous manner to their landscape, then it will also give them benefits. They can then extract certain things like hunting, like extracting various plant species. But there is certain, there's a neat little story here. I'll read this one because it's pretty short. It says, if you worship and believe in the holiness of the lake, they say you'll be blessed. So when an elderly monk offered sincere prayers, the lake, meaning the spirit in the lake, it offered him blessings for cattle. And the lake told him to wish for however many cattle he could take care of. And the elder monk then thought about how he could only take care of about 8 or 9. Now, this story is told in very much reverence to this characteristic of this person, that they were very frugal, and they weren't just thinking, oh, I'm going to wish for 1,000 yaks or even 100 yaks. Thinking in terms of just profit or just the individual, you'd think that someone would wish for that many yaks. But in this story, and this elder monk is really revered highly in this community, they thought, oh, I just need 8 or 9, and that's okay. And so that type of behavior, that type of approach to how you look at the environment, how you're going to impact the environment, is seen as a very high characteristic quality in terms of how someone goes about managing their surroundings. There's also something I talk about called the Terma tradition in the paper. And this is a Buddhist idea. Terma are essentially hidden treasures in the landscape. And I talk more about the history of this belief and this tradition. But essentially, there's this belief that no matter where you go on the landscape, there could be hidden treasures, whether they're Buddhist teachings or even actual sort of treasures in the more traditional sense of gold and silver or whatever it is. But it gives a reverence that you don't want to just go around digging or hurting the surrounding environment, because it's sort of blessed. It's been blessed by various Buddhist saints and spiritual beings, and so you want to protect it. So that, again, sort of that idea and that belief system promotes certain kinds of behaviors on the landscape. The second thing is identity. Again, the perceptions of the landscape influence how a subject views themselves, which is linked to specific knowledge and certain behaviors. So there's this expression of belonging, and there's a saying, if you know the forest well, it's a cornucopia. It can give you all sorts of benefits. But if you don't know it, it's a killing machine. And this was a quote from one of the yak herders that I was interviewing, and he had a strong sort of connection to the land, and he was really proud of that he has a knowledge. He knows how to live. He could survive for months on end on this landscape because he knows things. He knows where to find things. And that was a source of pride for him. And so there's this, and there's also this expression of not belonging, meaning, he was from Ha, but there's other people from another place called Paro. And there's all sorts of stories about how Ha and Paro people were sort of in conflict, and they know their land, they need to stay over here. I know my land, I need to stay here. So there was also some segregation kind of ideas going on there, but it was very much tied to the knowledge, how they knew aspects of the landscape in a very intimate way. Now there is not that segregation still, and there's lots of Ha and Paro people that marry today and interact, but it was really kind of tied into this idea of just knowing your land and knowing your resources in a very intimate way. And so traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, here I call it TEK, we're seeing some transmission going on, but again, it's evolving. And I talked about that generational aspect, and that is a problem right now, that we're seeing that indigenous knowledge is not being translated in the same way to the new generation of people on the landscape. And so that is a problem that they're starting to experience. And here there are a few quotes from some of my interviewees. This is a quote from from the younger generation, who's starting to recognize that they don't have the same intimate experience with their landscape, and that's impacting how they view themselves, and it's also starting to impact how they adopt certain conservation practices. Here we say, he says, I like visiting these places, but I never think of living there. My uncle's connection with the landscape is very deep, as he didn't just listen to his parents or his elders and their teachings, but it is also his lifelong experience of living in it. He goes on, I think I'm at the apex of this social transition of going from farm life or herding life to a service-based lifestyle, meaning going out to the cities and serving and working normal jobs kind of thing, or normal jobs. In my family and in the families of most of my friends, our parents are the last generation to work on the farm or in the herds. I also feel that I am a hypocrite and an ironical person, as I studied to conserve my culture by staying away from my culture. So this person went out, got a university degree, but kind of feels this disconnect, that he's not able to connect to his landscape in a very deep way as his previous generation did. I know I'm kind of running out of time here. I'm almost done here. This third final finding is social ecological relations. How these perceptions of landscapes are really important for how they perceive their relationship. And one is, I make a distinction between dominance and inferiority. The dominance is sort of what I would call a more Western idea of how we interact with our environment. We go in thinking we have science, we have technology, we will manage and we will dominate the landscape how we want. We will extract its resources, we'll take what we want from it, whatever we need. That's one type of perception that we have. Now, people on the hall landscape that I experience with is very much a perception of inferiority, meaning there's a flipping of this sort of dynamic of it's not humans at the top exerting control, but the humans are more at the bottom, and they're more at the mercy of this whole set of spiritual beings that dominate what can happen on the landscape. And so it's the humans at the bottom to appease this spiritual hierarchy. They have to ask permission to do various things, otherwise they can't really benefit from what's going on in the landscape. So there's humans are really seen as insignificant compared to the other actors that are on the landscape. And so I refer to one of the spiritual beings here called a Lu, but Lus are kind of seen as the owners. They're the owners of the landscape, and it's the humans that are the residents. It's the humans that have to pay tribute, that have to ask permission. And so that whole flipping of that hierarchy from dominance to inferiority is really important to understanding, again, our perception of the humans and where they are on the landscape, and that impacts how they act, again, impacting their conservation type of behaviors. And so the attitudes that they have are much more relational, how they interact, how they are going about to interact with the landscape. Last little story here. There's a saying that the Highlanders have called Shindo Relu Lasure. It means that in every tree there lies a deity. And once upon a time, a man was traveling. He decided to sleep under a tree, and he prayed to that tree, asking for protection. And that night, a demon visited and was going to eat him, but the tree protected him. And so again, there's this idea that you can interact in a way, you appease deities or even aspects of the landscape like these trees, and they can protect you. But it involves a very humble attitude going towards and interacting with these various aspects of the landscape. I know I'm almost out of time here. I'm going to skip these last couple of bullets that really get into more of the theoretical aspects. Just a few pictures there of some of my interactions. I'm not going to be able to explain some of them. I'm going to skip that as well. But I did want to just return to this idea of indigenous knowledge and the importance of what it has in terms of how we have a very managerial, Western, scientific sort of perspective of how we manage the environment, or is it more relational? And indigenous knowledge perspectives tend to be more holistic in that sense, tend to be more relational, seeing how you can have a more sort of, hopefully a positive attitude in your interactions with your surroundings. And there's a lot being done right now, especially if you guys are familiar with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that are going about promoting Indigenous knowledge in policy practice. And so there's a lot of countries, governments around the world that are signatories to UNDRIP. And in particular, I'll just highlight the work I'm doing right now with the British Columbia government in Canada. We have actually not only a signature to UNDRIP, but have developed our own act called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in British Columbia. And we're doing our best as a provincial government to partner with Indigenous governments in Canada or in British Columbia to do more about how we can partner with them in terms of resource management, in terms of forestry, mining, and how can we incorporate Indigenous knowledge into a lot of those discussions around resource management, and really recognizing the importance that Indigenous knowledge has for conservation, for protecting important sites, cultural sites, but also just ensuring that we manage our resources in an appropriate way that is not only important for conserving the physical aspects, but also doing it in a just way, that we acknowledge the importance of Indigenous people on the land. So with that, I know I'm at my time. I did have a video to show, but we're not going to have time to do that. And I'm going to end there and hand it back over to the chair and co-chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesse. It is very interesting. I wish we had more time to listen to you for the entire story. And unfortunately, we don't have time for discussion. So
no problem.
I would encourage the participants to post questions if you have any. And then probably, Jesse, if there is any questions, you can actually directly answer them if there is any. So
happy to do so. And I hope you guys have the resources.
Right. It's beyond my